The supply inventory I'd been putting off for 3 weeks revealed that 12 unsupervised cubs had built a functioning municipal government in Bay 3, complete with a waste management system I didn't understand. Let me back up. You need context for this, colleagues. You need to understand what Bay 3 was supposed to be. Bay 3 was storage. Just storage. 50 meters of stacked cargo containers, spare environmental filters, and the kind of industrial cleaning supplies that come in drums large enough to bathe in. I was cargo bay supervisor on Station Kethril for 6 cycles. 6 cycles of routine. 6 cycles of knowing exactly where everything was, even if I hadn't physically checked in. Well, 3 weeks. I had reasons for the delay. Good reasons. Bay 2 had a coolant leak. Bay 5 needed complete reorganization after we took on that emergency medical shipment. Bay 7 still had its flooding problem that engineering swore they'd fix but never did. Bay 3 could wait. Except Bay 3 had 12 Crevathee cubs in it. Let me explain that part. The cubs weren't supposed to be unsupervised. Their parents worked station maintenance, different shifts, and there was supposed to be a rotation, childcare arrangements, adult supervision. But you know how it is when everyone's overworked. Someone's shift runs long, someone else gets called to an emergency, and suddenly 12 cubs between 3 and 5 cycles old are entertaining themselves in my cargo bay for 2 weeks. I opened the door expecting chaos. Crevathee cubs are predators. They have retractable claws, needle teeth, and bioluminescent whiskers that flash when they're excited. 12 of them loose in a storage bay should have meant shredded containers, toppled shelves, and supplies scattered like someone had detonated an enthusiasm bomb. Instead, I found streets. Actual streets. Organized into a grid pattern. The cargo containers had been rearranged, not randomly, but into structures. Buildings. Some stacked too high with the smaller equipment crates forming second stories. The cleaning supply drums formed perfect cylindrical towers at what appeared to be intersection points. I stood in the doorway for a full minute just staring. The streets had traffic patterns. I could see the flow marks worn into the dust. Some paths were wider than others. There was a central plaza area where someone had arranged the environmental filters into tiered seating around a flat space. And there were signs. Tiny signs made from torn packaging material and bent wire, stuck into the ground at regular intervals. I walked closer, my claws clicking on the deck plating until I reached the first street. The sign had symbols on it. Crude, yes, but deliberate. Directional arrows. Distance markers. Oh good, you found it. I spun around. The human stood in the doorway. Nancy. She'd arrived on station 5 weeks ago, passenger transfer, waiting for her connection to the outer colonies, paid for extended stay, kept to herself mostly. I'd seen her in the commissary, always working on her tablet, reviewing what looked like floor plans and seating arrangements. She was a wedding planner, her visa said. Event coordinator. Made a living organizing complicated social ceremonies for species who apparently couldn't figure out how to throw a party without professional help. She walked past me into the Cub City like she owned it. I've been meaning to talk to you about this, she said, stepping carefully over one of the smaller streets. But you seemed busy with Bay 2. You knew about this? I've been consulting. She crouched down next to one of the buildings, adjusting a container that had shifted slightly out of alignment. They're very creative once you give them some basic principles. Basic principles. Spatial relationships, traffic flow, zoning. She stood up, brushed dust off her knees. Same concepts I use for wedding venues, really. You'd be surprised how similar urban planning is to seating charts. I stared at her. My whiskers had stopped glowing entirely, which happens when my brain can't process what's happening. The cubs did this. Well, yes. Nancy walked toward the central plaza. I found them in here about 2 weeks ago. They'd already started building, just randomly. No organization. I suggested they might want to think about purpose before placement. You know, what goes where and why. You suggested. They're very smart. She said it like this was obvious, like everyone knew Crevathee cubs were capable of urban planning. They just needed someone to ask them the right questions. I followed her deeper into the city. It was more complex than I'd initially seen. The buildings weren't just stacked containers. Some had doorways cut into them, perfectly sized for cubs. Others had windows, actual windows, made from the transparent plastic sheeting we used for equipment covers. This district is residential, Nancy said, gesturing to a cluster of smaller structures. That area is commercial. They have a trading post where they exchange items. And that tall building there is administrative. Administrative. They needed somewhere to keep records. Records of the trades and the laws. She pointed to another area. That's the judicial building. They hold trials there when someone breaks a rule. My claws were digging into the deck plating, not from anger, from complete cognitive failure. They have laws. Of course they have laws. You can't have a society without agreed-upon behavioral standards. Nancy spoke like she was explaining something simple to a cub. They started with basic property rights, then developed a more complex legal code. It's actually quite sophisticated. A cub emerged from one of the buildings. Small, even for a cub, with silver fur and bright green whiskers. It saw Nancy and its whiskers flashed excitedly. "Hi, Kip," Nancy said. "Is everything ready for the morning assembly?" The cub chirped something. Crevathee cubs don't develop full speech until around cycle 6, but they have a complex chirp and whistle language. I understood it, obviously. Kip was reporting that the water distribution system was functioning properly, and the sanitation crew had completed their morning rounds. Water distribution, sanitation crew. "Excellent work," Nancy told him. Kip's whiskers glowed brighter, then he scampered back into his building. "That's Kip," Nancy said. "He's the mayor." The mayor. They needed someone to coordinate between districts. Kip volunteered. They held an election. I walked toward the administrative building, drawn by horrified fascination. Inside, through the cut doorway, I could see shelves made from smaller containers. Papers. Actual papers, torn from packaging materials, with symbols and drawings on them. "The record-keeping is impressive," Nancy said from behind me. "They've documented every trade, every law passed, every dispute resolved. Sarah, their main architect, keeps separate files for building plans." Their architect. She's very talented. Natural understanding of structural integrity. Nancy walked past me toward another section of the city. "Come on, I'll show you the marketplace." The marketplace was chaos, but organized chaos. Cubs scurried between buildings, carrying items, a piece of wire, a plastic cap, a bolt. They met at the central structure, exchanged items, chirped negotiations, and scattered again. "They're trading," I said stupidly. "Of course. They developed a currency system about 4 days in." Nancy picked up something from the ground, a dried meat strip, the kind we gave cubs as treats. "This is worth 1 standard bolt. 3 bolts get you a shiny washer. Washers are premium currency." A slightly larger cub approached Nancy, chirping insistently. It held up a particularly shiny washer. "Yes, I see it," Nancy said. "That's worth at least 5 meat strips. You should hold on to it. The cub chirped again, offering the washer to Nancy. For me? Are you sure? More chirps. Well, thank you, Sarah. I'll keep it safe. The cub, Sarah apparently, bounded away looking pleased. They like you, I said. I helped them solve problems. Yesterday they had a zoning dispute between residential and commercial districts. Noise complaints. We worked out a compromise with designated quiet hours. That's when Mira arrived. Mira was our medical officer, and she burst through the bay door with her emergency kit, whiskers flashing alarm colors. I got a report that cubs were unsupervised in the cargo bay. Where are they? Are they injured? She stopped when she saw the city. What? She said slowly. Am I looking at? Municipal infrastructure, Nancy replied. Mira walked forward like she was approaching a dangerous animal. The cubs built this? With some guidance. Some guidance. Mira's voice climbed an octave. They're 3 cycles old. 3 to 5 cycles, I corrected automatically. They're babies. A cub emerged from what Nancy had called the judicial building, larger than Kip, with dark brown fur and orange whiskers. It chirped authoritatively at Mira. He's asking why you're disturbing the peace, Nancy translated, and whether you have proper authorization to enter their territory. Their territory? Mira's whiskers went full strobe. They've declared sovereignty, Nancy said, about a week ago. The cub chirped again, more insistently. He says if you're here on medical business, you need to coordinate with their hospital wing. Their what? Nancy pointed to another building. They set up basic first aid. Nothing serious, just treatment for minor scrapes and bruises. They're very safety conscious. The cub chirped once more, then turned and walked back into the judicial building with the bearing of someone who had important business. That's Tolk, Nancy said. He's the constable, enforces the laws. Mira turned to me. Vector, explain this. I can't. We both turned to Nancy. She smiled. I only gave them basic design principles. How to think about space, flow, purpose. They extrapolated. Cubs don't extrapolate, Mira said. Cubs destroy things and fall asleep in piles. These cubs apparently do both, I said. That's when Krill showed up. Krill was station administrator, which meant he cared about protocols the way some people care about breathing. He appeared in the doorway holding his tablet like a weapon. Unauthorized construction in Cargo Bay 3, he announced. Violation of station regulations 4, 7, 12, and 31. Immediate dismantling required. He stepped into the bay, saw the city. His whiskers went completely dark. What is this? A learning experience? Nancy offered. Krill walked forward, tablet forgotten. He knelt down next to one of the streets, examining the careful arrangement. Touched one of the buildings. Looked up at the taller structures. They built a city. Technically a town, Nancy said. The population's under 50. In 3 weeks. 2 weeks. They didn't really get organized until I helped them establish districts. Krill stood up. Looked at Mira. Looked at me. Looked at Nancy. This has to be dismantled. Actually, Nancy said, pulling out her own tablet. You might want to check Station Charter Section 31, Subsection B. What about it? Any group that establishes autonomous governance structures with documented legal codes and functional infrastructure can petition for recognized territory status. She turned her tablet around. The Cubs filed their petition this morning. It's technically valid. Krill stared at the screen. They wrote a constitution. Kip drafted it. Sarah illustrated it. Very thorough. Nancy scrolled through the document. They even included amendment procedures. This can't be legal. It's not legal. Nancy shrugged. The charter doesn't specify species or age requirements for autonomous governance. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. 6 cycles of routine and 12 cubs had just legally established an independent colony in my cargo bay using station regulations and a human wedding planner. Krill's whiskers were flashing through every color in the stress spectrum. "The commander," he said finally, "is going to shut this down." "He can try," Nancy said. Krill spent 6 hours with the station legal database. 6 hours of him muttering about loopholes and precedent, while Mira and I watched the cubs go about their daily business, like they hadn't just triggered a constitutional crisis. The problem, Krill finally admitted, was that the cubs were technically correct. Section 31, subsection B was written for colony establishment, he said, whiskers twitching with frustration. It assumes applicants are adults. It assumes they have ships and resources and intent to develop uninhabited areas. But it doesn't say that, Nancy pointed out. She was sitting on an overturned crate reviewing something on her tablet. Seating arrangements, probably. Or city layouts? With her, who could tell? It doesn't explicitly exclude cubs, Krill admitted, because no one thought cubs would build a functioning government. Oversight on your part, Nancy said mildly. Mira was examining the hospital wing. She'd gone in skeptical and emerged looking disturbed. They have a triage system, basic but logical, and their bandage supply is better organized than mine. They requisitioned the bandages through proper trading channels, Nancy said. Exchanged premium washers for them. With who? I asked. Me. I had a first aid kit. She didn't look up from her tablet. Seemed reasonable. Krill made a noise like a dying compressor. You armed them with medical supplies. I enabled them to care for their citizens. Very different. That's when Nancy suggested the treaty meeting. Look, she said, finally setting down her tablet. You want access to your cargo bay. They want recognition of their territorial sovereignty. This is a negotiation, not a demolition. They're cubs, Krill said. They're cubs with a legal petition and functional infrastructure. Nancy stood up, brushing dust off her pants. I coordinate disputes between families who hate each other but need to share wedding venues. This is the same thing, just with more fur. Mira's whiskers perked up. You think you can negotiate with them? I've been negotiating with them for 2 weeks. How do you think the quiet hours happened? Nancy walked toward the administrative building. I'll set it up for tomorrow morning. Give Krill time to prepare a proposal. A proposal for what? Krill demanded. Mutual recognition, territorial boundaries, resource-sharing agreements, standard treaty stuff. She said it like treaty negotiations with preschool cubs were routine. I suggest you come with something better than dismantle everything. They won't respond well to that. She was right, of course. The next morning, we gathered in the central plaza, which the cubs had somehow prepared for formal proceedings. The environmental filters were arranged in a semicircle. Kip sat on the highest one, wearing what looked like a ceremonial collar made from braided wire. Sarah sat beside him with a stack of papers. Tolk stood at attention near the entrance, official and serious. 8 other cubs occupied the remaining seats, whiskers glowing in synchronized patterns that suggested formal communication. Nancy stood to the side, tablet ready. Thank you all for coming. This is a preliminary discussion regarding territorial recognition and resource allocation. Kip chirped something lengthy. Mayor Kip acknowledges the station's interest in Bay 3 access, Nancy translated. He proposes a compromise. The cubs maintain sovereignty over the established city limits, approximately 30 meters by 20 meters. The remaining base space reverts to station control. Krill's whiskers flickered. That's actually reasonable. They're very reasonable, Nancy said, when approached with respect. What do they want in return? I asked. More chirps from Kip, with Sarah adding supportive whistles. Formal recognition as an autonomous zone, permission to continue building within their territory, and a trade agreement for food supplies and building materials. Mira leaned forward. What are they offering? Kip chirped again, and this time Sarah held up several papers with detailed drawings. Consulting services, Nancy said. Specifically spatial organization and efficiency analysis. They've identified 17 inefficiencies in station layout and want to propose solutions. Cubs found inefficiencies, Krill said flatly. Would you like to see their analysis of Base 7's flooding problem? Nancy took one of Sarah's papers, passed it to Krill. Sarah identified the issue in 20 minutes. I looked at the drawing. It was crude, yes, but clear. Sarah had mapped the water flow, identified the blocked drainage port, and suggested a solution involving rerouting pipes through an adjacent bay. This would work, Krill said slowly. They see spatial relationships differently than we do, Nancy explained. Same way they built their city. They understand flow and purpose and connection. More chirping, this time from Tolk. He sounded official and slightly aggressive. Constable Tolk reminds everyone that this is a formal negotiation, Nancy said. He requests all parties maintain proper decorum. Krill set down the paper. I need to consult with Commander Thresh. Of course. We can reconvene this afternoon. Nancy made a note on her tablet. The Cubs will prepare a formal proposal document. We left them in their city, Kip already directing Sarah to start drafting while other Cubs scattered to their various duties. This is insane, Mira said once we were in the corridor. This is actually well organized, I corrected. Which is worse. Krill contacted Commander Thresh immediately. I wasn't present for that conversation, but I heard Thresh's roar from 2 corridors away. 20 minutes later, Thresh stormed into the cargo bay with 6 security personnel and an expression that could melt hull plating. Thresh was old guard, military background, believed in hierarchy and order and the proper way things should be done. He took one look at the Cub city and his whiskers went completely rigid. Absolutely not. Commander, Krill started. No. Thresh walked toward the city like he was advancing on an enemy position. This ends now. Dismantle it. Return the Cubs to their parents. Restore proper order. He crossed into the city limits. Tolk appeared from nowhere, chirping sharply. The constable says you're violating territorial boundaries, Nancy called from behind us. She'd followed Thresh in, tablet ready. I don't negotiate with Cubs, Thresh growled. Tolk chirped again, louder. 3 other Cubs emerged from buildings, forming a perimeter around the constable. He's placing you under arrest for unauthorized entry and threatening behavior, Nancy said calmly. He's what? Article 4 of their legal code, clearly posted at all entry points. Nancy gestured to small signs we'd all missed. You didn't check in at the border station. Border station, Thresh repeated. That building there. You're supposed to declare your purpose and receive temporary access permits. Thresh's whiskers blazed bright red. I'm the station commander. In station territory, yes. In autonomous territory, you're a foreign diplomat who just committed a violation. Nancy checked her tablet. According to their laws, you're subject to detention until a hearing can be arranged. This is ridiculous. Tolk chirped something sharp and definitive. The other cubs moved closer, their claws extended slightly, whiskers flashing warning colors. "He's serious," I said. "Commander, they have established law enforcement protocols. They're cubs. Cubs with a legally questionable but technically valid constitutional framework," Krill added. "If we violate their laws, they could argue we've invalidated their sovereignty claim, which strengthens their petition." Thresh looked at all of us like we'd lost our minds. "You're telling me I'm under arrest?" "Detained pending hearing," Nancy corrected. "Different legal status." "Where exactly do they plan to detain me?" Tolk chirped and gestured toward a building. "The judicial building," I realized. He was gesturing toward the cub jail. "You can't be serious," Thresh said. "They take their laws very seriously," Nancy replied. "I suggest you cooperate. It'll be easier to negotiate from a position of good faith compliance." Thresh stared at her, at Tolk, at the growing number of cubs emerging from buildings to watch the proceedings. "How long is this detention?" Nancy consulted with Kip through a series of chirps. "Until you post bail or attend a hearing. Hearings are held twice daily. Next one is in 3 hours." "Bail," Thresh said dangerously. 5 premium washers or equivalent trade goods." "I don't have washers." "I can loan you some," Nancy offered. "Though, you'll need to repay with interest. Their lending code is quite specific." I watched the station commander, decorated military veteran and leader of 600 personnel, calculate whether his dignity could survive cub jail. "The hearing," he finally said. 3 hours. "Excellent choice." Nancy made another note. "Constable Tolk will escort you to the detention facility. I recommend you use the time to prepare your defense." Tolk chirped officiously and gestured toward the judicial building. Thresh followed, moving like a man in a nightmare. The detention facility, we discovered when checking on him 2 hours later, was actually quite comfortable. The cubs had furnished it with cushions salvaged from packing materials, arranged water and food within reach, and even provided reading material in the form of their constitution and legal code. Thresh sat in the middle of the cushion pile, reading the Constitution with an expression of growing horror. "This is actually well written," he said when he saw us. "Kip's very thorough," Nancy said. "They have separation of powers, checks and balances, amendment procedures." Thresh looked up. "Who taught them this?" "I asked them how they wanted to organize their society," Nancy said. "They extrapolated from observation. Apparently they've been watching station operations for months." Watching operations. "They're cubs. Everyone ignores them. Turns out they were learning." She shrugged. "Once they had basic organizational principles, they applied what they'd observed about how we structure authority and governance." "From watching us," Thresh repeated slowly. "And apparently from watching me coordinate events. Kip mentioned something about how I organize complicated gatherings with competing interests and limited resources." Nancy smiled slightly. "He found the comparison useful." Mira arrived with medical supplies. "I'm checking on the prisoner." "Detainee," Nancy corrected. "The commander doesn't need medical attention," Thresh said firmly. "Protocol requires wellness checks for all detained individuals," Mira said, reading from a paper Sarah had given her. "Article 6, subsection 3. Thresh submitted to the examination with the rigid dignity of someone who'd lost control of reality. "You're healthy," Mira confirmed. "I'll note that in the official record." "Official record," Thresh muttered. The hearing convened in the central plaza. Kip presided from his elevated seat. Sarah beside him with documentation. 8 cubs formed the jury. Tolk presented the charges. Nancy served as Thresh's advocate, which she claimed was similar to coordinating between difficult family members at rehearsal dinners. The trial lasted 40 minutes. Tolk presented evidence of boundary violation and threatening behavior. Nancy argued Thresh was unfamiliar with local laws and deserved leniency as a first-time offender. The jury deliberated through a series of chirps and whisker flashes. Kip delivered the verdict. Guilty, but with reduced sentencing due to ignorance of local customs. The sentence was a formal apology and agreement to respect territorial boundaries in future. Thresh, to his credit, delivered the apology with dignity. I apologize for violating your borders and failing to respect your legal framework. I will observe proper protocols in future interactions. Kip chirped acceptance. Tolk officially released Thresh from detention. We walked back to the bay entrance in silence. Thresh stopped at the doorway, turned back to look at the city. They really did build this themselves, he said. With guidance on principles, Nancy said. But yes, the implementation is entirely theirs. And they want to help us fix Bay 7. Among other things, Sarah has 17 proposals. Thresh's whiskers cycled through several colors. I need to see those proposals. I can arrange a consultation, Nancy offered. Tomorrow morning, perhaps? Give everyone time to process today's events? Process, Thresh said. Right. Process the fact that I was just convicted in Cub Court. You were found guilty, Nancy corrected. There's a difference. Thresh left without another word. Krill lingered. This is going to change everything, isn't it? Probably, I said. They're going to want to see Sarah's other proposals, Nancy said. And once engineering realizes cubs can solve spatial problems that have stumped them for months, well, we're going to end up employing cubs as consultants, Mira finished. Junior consultants, Nancy corrected. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But we all knew it was too late for that. The engineering review of Sarah's proposals happened at 0800 hours the next morning, and by 08:30 the chief engineer was having what I can only describe as an existential crisis. His name was Drask, 20 cycles of experience, designed half the station's current infrastructure. He sat in the central plaza surrounded by papers covered in crude drawings while Sarah watched him with the patient interest of someone waiting for a slow learner to catch up. This shouldn't work, Drask said, holding up the Bay 7 solution. The angle is wrong. The flow dynamics don't match our models. Sarah chirped and produced another drawing. This one showed water flow in 3 dimensions, somehow conveyed through overlapping lines and shading. She says your models assume uniform pressure distribution, Nancy translated. But Bay 7 has variable pressure because of the ventilation system 2 levels up. She's accounting for that. Drask stared at the drawing, put it down, picked it up again. How did she know about the ventilation system? She mapped it. They've been exploring the station through the maintenance shafts. Nancy said this like it was perfectly normal. Cubs are small. They fit places we don't. They've been in the maintenance system, Drask said slowly. For weeks, apparently. That's how they gathered building materials. Nancy gestured around the city. Most of this came from abandoned supplies in forgotten storage spaces. There are no forgotten storage spaces, Drask protested. I know every meter of this station. Sarah chirped something that sounded suspiciously like disagreement. She produced a whole stack of papers, each one showing a different hidden space, complete with location markers and contents lists. Drask went through them one by one. His whiskers cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally resignation. She's right. These are all real, and I didn't know about half of them. He looked at Sarah with something approaching respect. You mapped the entire maintenance network? Sarah chirped proudly. Kip added supporting chirps from his mayoral seat. He says it was a collaborative effort, Nancy translated. All the Cubs contributed to the mapping project. Sarah just compiled the data. Cubs, Drask said to no one in particular. Cubs have better documentation of my station than I do. Thresh arrived with Krill and 3 more engineers. They'd come to review the proposals, probably expecting to find flaws and dismiss the whole thing. Instead, they found Drask sitting in stunned silence while a 5-cycle-old Cub explained advanced fluid dynamics through chirps and drawings. Tell me this isn't happening, Thresh said. She's correct about Bay 7, Drask replied. And her solution would cost us maybe 200 credits in materials. We were about to spend 50,000 on a complete replumbing project. One of the other engineers picked up a different proposal. This one's about the environmental recycling system. That one's Kip's work, Nancy said. He noticed inefficiencies in resource distribution. The engineer read through it. Her whiskers went pale. This would increase our recycling efficiency by 18%. 22%, Nancy corrected. According to Kip's calculations, he's being conservative in the proposal. Cubs don't do calculations, Thresh said, but it sounded more like a desperate hope than a statement of fact. These Cubs apparently do. They had to figure out resource management for their city. Nancy pulled up something on her tablet. They've been running a working economy for 2 weeks. That requires math. Mira was examining another proposal, this one about medical supply storage. This is actually brilliant. If we rearranged the storage according to this pattern, average retrieval time would drop by 30%. That's Tolk's suggestion, Nancy said. He's very efficiency-focused. The constable has opinions about medical logistics, Mira said faintly. The constable has opinions about everything, I muttered. He tried to cite me for improper street maintenance yesterday. Were you improperly maintaining the streets? Nancy asked. I walked through without checking in at the border station. Then the citation was valid. Thresh picked up another proposal, read it, set it down carefully. This one suggests rebuilding our docking bay traffic patterns. That's Sarah's most ambitious project, Nancy confirmed. She thinks the current layout causes unnecessary congestion during shift changes. It does cause congestion, Thresh admitted. We've been trying to solve that problem for 2 cycles. Sarah solved it in 3 days. The engineers spread out, each taking proposals, reading in growing silence. I watched their whiskers fade from skeptical colors to shocked colors to the pale shade of people whose expertise just became obsolete. They want to redesign the station, one engineer finally said. Not redesign, optimize. Nancy gestured to Sarah. They're not trying to replace our systems. They're trying to improve efficiency within existing constraints. Using wedding planning principles, I said, because someone had to acknowledge the absurdity. Using spatial relationship principles that I happened to explain through wedding planning contexts, Nancy corrected. The principles are universal. How you organize people at tables is fundamentally the same as how you organize resources in space. Purpose, flow, accessibility. Thresh set down the last proposal. If even half of these work, they'll all work, Drask interrupted. I've checked Sarah's calculations. She's not guessing. She understands the systems. By watching us, Krill said. By observing and learning and applying what they saw. And by having Nancy teach them to think about space intentionally, Mira added. Everyone looked at Nancy. She was making notes on her tablet, unbothered by the attention. I taught them to ask questions, she said. Why is this here? What purpose does it serve? How do things move through this space? Same questions I ask about wedding venues. They applied those questions to everything. And built a city, Thresh said. And mapped the station, Drask added. And created 17 optimization proposals that would save us roughly 200,000 credits in planned upgrades. Krill finished, looking at his own tablet with disbelief. Kip chirped something lengthy. Sarah added supportive chirps. Tolk nodded officially. They're willing to help implement the solutions, Nancy translated. But they want their territory formally recognized first. They're not doing this for free. What do they want? Thresh asked. More chirps, this time from the whole council. They'd clearly discussed this. Permanent territory rights to Bay 3 Limited Section. Formal status as junior planning consultants. Access to proper building materials through official channels instead of scavenging. And, Nancy paused, reading her notes. They want their city recognized as a legitimate learning zone for other cubs. Other cubs, Thresh repeated. They want to teach other cubs what they've learned. Organizational principles, collaborative building, civic planning. Nancy looked up from her tablet. They think all cubs should learn this. They want to start a school, Mira said. They want to share knowledge, Nancy corrected. The SATSO format is negotiable. Thresh sat down on one of the environmental filters. He looked tired suddenly, older than his cycles. If we do this, he said slowly, if we officially recognize them and implement their proposals, we're admitting that cubs understand our station better than we do. Not better, Drask said. Differently. They see things we don't because they're small and curious and not bound by assumptions about how things should be. They also have Nancy, I pointed out. I just asked questions, Nancy said. They did everything else. Sarah chirped something and held up one more paper. This one was different from the others. More detailed, more ambitious. What's that? Thresh asked. Nancy took it, studied it, and her eyebrows rose. It's their proposal for the complete rebuild. Complete rebuild of what? Bay 3. They want to dismantle their city and rebuild it as a working diagnostic model of Bay 7's entire infrastructure. Nancy read further. They're offering to use their city as a testing ground for the flooding solution. Build it to scale, verify it works. Then we implement it in the actual bay. They'd destroy their own city, Krill said. They'd evolve it, Nancy corrected. Turn it from a living space into a functional model, then rebuild the living space afterward using better materials we'd provide. Why would they do that? Mira asked. Kip chirped, and even I understood the meaning. Purpose, contribution, being useful. They want to help, Nancy said softly. They built their city to prove they could. Now they want to do something meaningful with what they've learned. Thresh looked at the drawing, at the cubs gathered in their plaza, waiting for his decision, at Nancy, who somehow made all this seem logical. There's one condition, he said finally. I want Nancy to supervise the rebuild. Official capacity. I'm a wedding planner, Nancy protested. You're a spatial organization specialist who speaks fluent cub, Thresh countered. And apparently the only one they'll listen to. So you're hired. Temporary contract. Liaison between cub consultants and station engineering. I have a connection to catch in 3 weeks. Then we have 3 weeks to fix Bay 7 and establish protocols for future cub involvement. Thresh stood up. Because if this works, every parent on this station is going to want their cubs learning from Kip and Sarah. Nancy looked at her tablet, at the cubs, at the city they'd built. I'll need that in writing, she said, and the cubs need to agree. Kip chirped immediately. The other cubs joined in, whiskers flashing agreement. They agree, Nancy confirmed, but they want one thing first. What? Thresh asked warily. A ceremony, official recognition. They want it done properly. She smiled slightly. They want me to officiate. The ceremony happened at 1400 hours the following day, and Nancy treated it exactly like a wedding. She'd spent the morning coordinating with the cubs on proper protocol. Kip insisted on formal processional order. Sarah designed a backdrop using their nicest building materials. Tolk established security perimeters that no one dared cross after the Thresh incident. Nancy stood in the central plaza wearing what I assumed were her professional clothes, tablet in hand, expression serious. Thresh, Krill, Drask, and Mira formed the station's official delegation. Roughly 40 station personnel gathered at the city borders, curious about the cubs who'd apparently redesigned half our infrastructure in their spare time. The cubs processed in by district. Residential cubs first, then commercial, then administrative. Kip entered last, still wearing his wire collar, carrying their constitution on a piece of carefully smoothed packaging material. Nancy waited until everyone settled. Then she spoke. We gather today to formally recognize the autonomous territory established by the cubs of Bay 3. They have demonstrated the requirements outlined in Station Charter Section 31, Subsection B, through the creation of functional governance, documented legal frameworks, and sustainable infrastructure. She made it sound dignified, important. Not like 12 cubs had accidentally exploited a legal loophole. Mayor Kip, on behalf of your citizens, do you accept the responsibilities of recognized territorial status? Kip chirped solemnly. He accepts, Nancy translated, and pledges to maintain peaceful cooperation with Station Kethril. Commander Thresh, on behalf of Station Kethril, do you recognize the territorial sovereignty of the Bay 3 settlement? Thresh stepped forward. I'd never seen him look uncomfortable before, but he managed it now. I do. Station Kethril recognizes the settlement and welcomes them as junior planning consultants. Nancy made a note on her tablet with the same care she probably used recording wedding vows. Then by the authority vested in me as appointed liaison, I declare this territory officially recognized. May both parties prosper through cooperation and mutual respect. The cubs erupted in chirps and whisker flashes. The station personnel applauded, because apparently we were applauding cubs now. Thresh signed a physical document Nancy had prepared. Kip marked it with an ink pad and his paw print. It was legally binding, completely absurd, and somehow perfect. Now, Nancy said, let's talk about the rebuild. The dismantling started immediately. The cubs worked with the focused efficiency of people who understood exactly what they were building toward. They carefully separated materials by type, documented everything, created organized supply stations. Nancy coordinated like she was managing venue setup. She'd established a timeline, assigned roles, created contingency plans. The cubs followed her direction with the same seriousness they'd brought to building their city. Sarah worked with Drask, translating her drawings into specifications the engineering team could follow. They built the Bay 7 model in sections, testing each component before moving to the next. It took 18 hours. 18 hours to dismantle a city and rebuild it as a functional diagnostic model, complete with working water systems, pressure sensors, and the drainage solution Sarah had designed. They tested it at 0800 the next morning. Drask ran water through the system while Sarah watched, whiskers tense. The water flowed, followed the redirected paths, drained properly through the modified ports. Zero flooding. Perfect pressure distribution. Exactly as Sarah predicted. Drask stood there watching water drain correctly, and his whiskers cycled through colors I'd never seen before. "It works," he said. "It actually works." "Of course it works," Nancy said. "Sarah's been right about everything else." They implemented the solution in actual Bay 7 over the next week. The flooding stopped. Engineering ran tests, found the efficiency improvements even exceeded Sarah's estimates. Word spread. Other cubs started appearing in Bay 3, brought by parents who'd heard about the projects. Kip and Sarah welcomed them, started teaching the same organizational principles Nancy had taught them. Nancy supervised, coordinated, translated between cub chirps and adult confusion. She made it look easy, like teaching spatial design principles to predator cubs was just another Tuesday. Her connection came up 3 weeks later, exactly on schedule. She'd fulfilled her contract, established protocols, trained replacement liaisons. I found her in Bay 3 the day before departure. The cubs had rebuilt their city, bigger now, with proper materials and better design. They were working on a new project, something about optimizing the commissary layout. "They'll miss you," I said. "They'll be fine. They don't need me anymore." Nancy checked her tablet one last time. They just needed someone to show them how to ask the right questions. And now they're redesigning the entire station. Just optimizing it. She smiled. "There's a difference." The next morning, Kip presented her with a gift. A carefully constructed model of their original city, perfectly preserved, mounted on a piece of polished deck plating. "So you remember," Nancy translated his chirps. "The first thing we built." She accepted it with the same seriousness she'd brought to their ceremony. "I won't forget." I walked her to the docking bay. Behind us, 12 cubs were already presenting Mira with proposals for medical bay optimization. "Do you do this everywhere?" I asked. "Find cubs and teach them to redesign infrastructure?" "I plan weddings," Nancy said. "This was just a side project." "You created a revolution in civic planning using event coordination principles." I asked some questions and let them figure out the answers. She adjusted her bag, checking her departure time. "Same thing I do with difficult relatives at rehearsal dinners, really." Her transport docked. Final boarding call. "Good luck with Bay 4, she said at the airlock. "Bay 4? The Cubs mentioned wanting to expand." I left some suggestions in the project files. She smiled. "You might want to check those." She boarded. The airlock sealed. The transport departed. I checked the project files on my way back to cargo operations. Bay 4 expansion plans. Bay 5 reorganization proposals. Bay 6 efficiency studies. And a complete redesign of the station's traffic management system. All credited to the junior planning consultants of Bay 3. I found Kip in the plaza, reviewing construction plans with Sarah and 6 new cubs who were learning infrastructure design. "New project?" I asked. Kip chirped and pointed to Bay 4. The transportation network Nancy had mentioned. They wanted to connect the bays using small-scale transit systems designed for cubs, but applicable to cargo movement. Of course they did. I approved the proposal, provided the materials, watched 12 cubs become 20, then 30, as more parents enrolled their cubs in what everyone now called the Bay 3 Learning Initiative. 6 months later, Our station efficiency ratings were the highest in the sector. Engineers from other stations started requesting consultations. We had to establish formal procedures for Cub-led infrastructure analysis, and every single proposal, every optimization, every improvement, traced back to one human wedding planner who'd taught 12 unsupervised Cubs to think about space intentionally. I still have her contact information. Last I heard, she was planning a diplomatic ceremony on an outer colony. I'm almost afraid to ask what she's teaching the Cubs there.